to the webinar Lunchtime Seminars of the Risk Center. Today we have with us Dr. Michelle Jameson, and we are so thrilled to be hearing about bridging the gap between objectivity and subjectivity, reflexivity and quantitative research. Dr. Michelle Jameson is a research fellow in data science for the Scottish Centre of Administrative Data Research. Their research interests include health, workforce, poverty, and social exclusion. They have contributed to policy development and advancing knowledge in public health. They have experience in critical quantitative methods and have developed innovative approaches that emphasize reflection and reflexivity in quantitative research. The floor is completely yours. And again, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanya. Thank you for inviting me, and yeah, thank you for reading out that the little bio. I never know what to put for those things, so I always ask colleagues and then I always think, is that me you're talking about? It's always so strange to hear your own stuff read back to you. But yes, thank you. Excited to be here today to talk about reflexivity and quants. And yeah, sounds perfect to me for a lunchtime here in rainy Glasgow. I'm always excited to talk about reflexivity and quants, so I think we should just get into it. So what I was thinking, because the paper itself is quite long, is I'll give I'll talk through a little summary. Feel free to ask questions throughout, like interrupt me, or I don't know, maybe you want to field questions, Vanya, if someone has their hand up virtually or in the chat. And yeah, feel free to interrupt me throughout, and then we have a wee bit more time at the end for discussion. If I am speaking too fast, feel free to tell me to slow down. If there's any issues with accent, feel free to let me know. I will not be put out at all by that. But yeah, so I think we'll just get going. And to be honest, I'm probably preaching to the choir here about reflexivity anyway, so happy to be corrected or any comments or anything along the way. So yeah, let me minimize me so I don't see my face as I talk. That's always helpful. So yes, hopefully you have had a wee chance to look at the paper. If not, it's up online and we can put the links in the chat. And again, like I said, probably preaching to the choir a little bit about reflexivity in any research, but especially in quants. So yeah, a wee bit about how the paper came to be. The paper came out of my PhD. I'd done a PhD in advanced quantitative methods at the University of Glasgow. Handed it in last year after a painful reroute because of COVID. So I was saying to Vanya before people you all joined us here today, my PhD was a very traditional social science statistics type PhD. I was looking at outcomes of people with psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia and psychosis and their employment across the lifespan. So that was accessing very traditional administrative type data. I have lived experience of certain mental health conditions. So as the PhD was progressing, I realised none of my own background and why I was engaging with the data I was engaging in, why I was wanting to look at certain things was coming out. And also was saying to Vanya, I trained as a psychologist in another life before coming into the quant side of things, and reflection and reflexivity and examining your own biases and where you stand runs throughout that, whether you practice clinically or not. So that's really where this paper grew out of. And at the end of the day, I ended up writing 2 whole separate methods chapters. One was for the traditional stat side of things, and one was what then became this paper. And it backed up why I included personal reflexive diary entries in my PhD at the end. It was received well at Viva. while I was doing it, there was a bit of confusion by the traditional statisticians, but they accepted it in the end, and this paper came out of it, so I think it was a win all round. But yes, the paper grew out of the PhD. But yeah, so a wee bit about reflexivity. Practices examining how our own assumptions, beliefs, and biases influence the research process throughout the process itself. As you probably already know, it's well established in qualitative research, but traditionally not so much in quantitative research. Certainly, I struggled a lot to find work that engaged in this way in quantitative research. And that's pushed me towards this paper. I'm not saying there isn't a call in action in quantitative type research that to use reflexivity, but certainly I would like it to be more of a thing than it already is. Yeah, and got together with my co-authors, Dr. Pauno and Dr. Govert, just from our own experiences in the psychology sphere, moving into different spheres with quantitative research. We just thought it would be really cool to have a little guide on how to do this. That was the one thing I came across whenever I spoke about this in my work, especially to those who were more traditional quant-based, like statisticians. Everyone loves to know why and how to do it, and they really wanted to know why and how. So I thought, well, let's write a little guide. Everyone loves a step-by-step guide, and I'll go into that, not to say the step-by-step guide and the paper is exhaustive, but yeah, certainly a good thing to point some people to begin with. And the paper, as well as being a sort of critical examination of reflexivity and how and why we should incorporate it more into quantitative methods, also offers at the end the practical steps for how you can get started. So yeah, the sort of core arguments of the paper. One, questioning objectivity. Very traditionally, quantitative research is assumed to be the neutral or objective position. I came across a lot of researchers, not to say their beliefs in quantitative research being objective is bad or good, but a lot of stuff I was coming across was quantitative research as the objective gold standard for measuring anything. And as a psychologist and human being, I thought this to assume that quantitative research can measure what is fundamentally subjective experience. I found that a little bit off-putting from the start, and that's not even getting into what you research, like yourselves researching educational outcomes, myself researching psychosis conditions. Yeah, a group of people can be diagnosed with a psychosis condition, but they will certainly not experience the same thing, even if they have similar unusual beliefs. Say 5 people out of 10 have unusual beliefs around nuclear war, they will not experience the exact same thing. So even within that, it becomes a whole other thing, and that's what really got me thinking about the inherent objectivity in quantitative research, because no research is truly free from bias, and being reflexive about this, because we are human beings at the end of the day. We should always, I think, be aware of our own biases and whether or not we agree with challenging the assumptions inherent in our research, whatever that is. Another argument I think that comes through in the paper is the sort of ethical dimension. We all want to be ethical in our research, I hope. Certainly yourselves in your department and the department I was in, even just with the data I was handling, psychiatric data, it's people at the end of the day, whether they're numbers or not. being reflexive, I think, does really contribute to you being ethical in your research and being actively aware of biases and how this influences everything from you, one, deciding to be a researcher, doing the research you do, generating your questions, choosing the data that you do, even down to doing the analysis you do, and of course influencing everything in the study along the way, and especially the outcomes. And I think this is relevant for all research. I've had very interesting arguments with, say, a theoretical mathematician and a theoretical physicist who were like, why is this relevant for me? And I had answers for them, but especially if your research is policy-based or involves marginalised people, if it has anything, if your research touches anything in the real world, which I argue is every bit of research, you should be considering reflexivity, but especially the work we are doing here today, yourselves in your department, myself and my research group. And yeah, just by the mere action of documenting your assumptions and biases, I think this offers a wee bit more of a transparent view into you as a researcher and why you're doing the things you do. I think by incorporating the reflexivity, it improves rigor because you are acknowledging those personal assumptions, those personal biases. It also means you could maybe recognise bias before you get to a later stage of your research. You can do the internal and external work to reduce these biases. You can question your decisions at every stage of the research down to why you want to do this research. Are you best placed to do this research? Why have you chose this sample? Why have you chose this analysis? Why are you interpreting it in this way? Are you interpreting it yourself? Are you including the people if you can? And it's right, whatever right is an interpretation, you can start to question all of these things. And I hope it doesn't come across as preachy when I'm talking about this here today. Some people might not have the capacity to do this. You might not have the funding, you might be early in your career, you might not feel able to challenge the status quo in your department, you might not be able to access is the wrong word, but access your participants. For example, I just had the data, I didn't know who the participants were. They might not be able to give their time to help you do this. Yes, as you can see, reflexivity opens up so many avenues of questions. It's, yeah, I think it's fascinating, which is why I'm here today. Yes, so hopefully it comes across in the paper that through integrating the reflexivity and quantitative methods, however that is, does go and can go a bit of a way to bridging the gap, just because it is so accepted and such a core practice held in qualitative research, and often in qualitative methods, whatever they might be, the researcher positionality is so intertwined with analysis that you can't actually break them apart, whether it's in quantitative, they're so opposite ends of the room most of the time. So of course, to me and others, hopefully, quantitative methodologies would benefit from this being intertwined. I truly believe it should going forward. Even if you're in a very theoretical, data-driven area like a theoretical physicist, for example, you might not think you would need to do this, but I would argue you do. And at the end of the day, I'll always, especially to naysayers who kind of poo-poo the idea, I think, well, it couldn't hurt, even if you treat it as a creative writing exercise with your work as the jump-off point, it couldn't hurt. So why not give it a go? That's what I always say. So, oh yes, and I should point out, and hopefully this also comes through in the paper, the sort of framework for bias mitigation. I don't go out and out to say it identifies bias in itself, because it's you at the end of the day doing the work, and hopefully you can catch and identify bias if there is any, and yourself, the research team, the stakeholders can generate ways to mitigate them if possible. Some biases, I suppose, can't be completely eradicated, or I suppose others would argue shouldn't be, but mitigating them, or certainly acknowledging them, that they're there, never hurts, in my opinion. And that includes questioning the biases that might be embedded in the wider methodology, certainly in quantitative methods and measurements. And yeah, I'm holding myself back from another tangent, going down the sort of methods and metric side of things when it comes to validity, external and internal validity. That's a whole other talk, I suppose. But yes, in terms of bias mitigation, I think the reflexivity framework, certainly the jumping off point we provide in the paper, yeah, would go quite a long way in helping people recognise biases if there is any, especially I think it's especially useful as a teaching tool when we're sort of teaching students fresh in about bias in research, or early career researchers all the way through to professors or whatever. So yeah, always good to refresh yourself on that side of things. So yeah, and the second part of the paper is the sort of practical guideline, or what was termed as the sort of beginner's guide, the little toolkit at the end, just as a way to start integrating it into your own practice, however that might look. And I would say the questions are very self-questioning, and we also give a little bit, I'm just having a wee look at the questions here, giving some worked examples at the end as well. Again, very valuable to people who are new to reflexivity, and even like I still go back to these same questions. I wrote these questions in a personal notebook way back when I was doing the PhD, and it came into the little toolkit later on when we were working it. I still go back to the same questions over and over again, because every time you go back to the same question, you might get a different answer, you get a different understanding, you might be working on a different project. It's, yeah, always helpful. And like I said a wee bit earlier, the toolkit at the end of the paper has proved invaluable for people who certainly come from the backgrounds where there is very concrete right and wrong answers. Certainly when you're coding analysis, there's right and wrong answers for getting the code to work. So being able to point them towards this toolkit and actual set questions has been invaluable. One, it takes away a lot of the fear for people in starting to be reflexive. I think a lot of people, or maybe it's just academics in general, are scared of doing it wrong. That's the only way I can kind of think of phrasing it just now. So being able to give them these questions, and they're quite set questions, they're open-ended but set, I think takes away the fear for a lot of people in starting, and the questions kind of snowball, and you'll get more and more out of it as you engage with it. But even in the say a very surface level beginner engagement with it, you will get something out of it, I think. So it's always helpful for that. Yeah, and hopefully you can all go on and have a wee look at the prompts. But there's a prompt for each stage from the design stage. So things like asking yourself how your own biases or assumptions might influence the research or design choice, like considering why you've chosen specific variables, or why you've excluded certain populations, or even down to why you as a researcher are doing this research. And I've had some interesting conversations about this. We're not saying if you're not an insider researcher, you shouldn't be doing research on certain populations, because certain populations, I hate the term hard to reach, certain populations, we just need to do better at reaching them. We should be doing better at reaching them. And of course, some people in some populations are very underrepresented in academia as a whole, and research still needs to be done. But even asking yourself the question, why am I wanting to do this project? Am I the right person to do this project? Should I be looking at collaborating with potential people in the population to help get this project off the ground? Is your population even going to be comfortable with you? Even just a very basic example I've used with previous students is when they're asking their population group to even come onto university campus and like do an experiment or fill in a survey. Not everyone is comfortable going onto a university campus. For example, Glasgow University, Russell Group University in the West End of Glasgow, had a student doing focus groups with working class people who'd had their benefits sanctioned on universal credit, and I just said to them that they were struggling for recruitment, and I said to them, well, one, have you left the West End of Glasgow to look for people and advertise your study, and two, are you giving them options that isn't coming on to a university campus that is in a very traditionally upper middle class area of Glasgow? Also hard to get to, if you know the transport system of Glasgow, expensive and hard to navigate because it's a really old building. So all of these things, even just thinking about that in terms of why you're doing it, has so many benefits. Yeah, and of course with the analysis, reflecting on your own positionality, how is that affecting how you interpret your findings? Even if it is very concrete, I have run a linear regression, the p-value is this. How are you interpreting that outside of the traditional, the p-value is significant or not, down to variables chosen, why you've chosen this regression, why you've chosen this method? Is there any cultural or personal biases that might lead to you interpreting it that way? And we've also wrote a little bit about how the analysis stage also includes asking if any data has been dismissed due to personal beliefs or preferences, and that's out width of like say collapsing categories to avoid disclosure risk and things like that. Like, have you dropped a variable for, I don't know, people in the army because you think they're not relevant to your analysis? Why? If so, why? So little things like that. And also just realised I used out width. What I just only learned was apparently a Scottish word, but there we go, you learn something new every day. So interpretation and reporting, obviously we're encouraged to document, or we encourage you to document the potential biases that could shape any conclusions, ensuring they're visible and like can also be challenged and evaluated in future studies. We've got certain questions around that as well. And then I think just at the very end, we go very quickly into how to document. So I think we have spoken about the sort of open science movement and platforms like GitHub and OSF. There's some really nice templates I can either link in the chat or pass on to Vania to pass around after we're finished talking. Certainly I created a template so you can put all the reflexive work that comes out of doing the reflexivity toolkit onto say OSF and like other people in your team can see it and add to it, and it can be as private or public as you want it to be, and obviously never feel pressured to put say personal reflective diaries and things up on that, but it goes some way in making it acceptable is the wrong word, but it's kind of making the practice more open and acceptable for others who might be afraid to put their own stuff up on a public platform like OSF. And the transparency also fosters the open and honest open science principles that we talk about in the sort of open science movement for reproducibility. And yeah, the takeaways. I suppose I've been jumping myself a little bit and sort of saying what I think the takeaways are from the paper and reflexivity as a whole. I think in the paper do we call it novel? I'm not saying that the paper we wrote is novel. Obviously, this isn't a new idea. We aren't saying anything new. I think yeah, hopefully the paper has brought the idea to a wider audience, certainly in the quantitative sphere, and making it more open and transparent and acceptable to bring that self-awareness into a really traditional area that maybe hasn't appreciated you being vocal about that self-awareness and reflexivity in your own work. Personally, I think it can only improve your scientific rigor and openness in your practice. It also, I hope, doesn't come across that we're trying to undermine objectivity, because we're not. It's more about just examining what objectivity is and what it means to you in your position as a researcher, and also complements it by recognising the sort of unavoidable impact you'll have as a human being and a researcher. And I hope that also encourages future researchers, and I hope we move towards some sort of standard where we can integrate this into quantitative methods and it sort of becomes just as accepted as it is in qualitative methods. That is the dream. We shall see if we ever get there, especially in sort of our research areas. And who knows, maybe theoretical physics will adopt it at some point. Yes, so I think I will, because I realise I've been talking for about half an hour now, and yeah, what is quite a funny area for some. So I think I will wrap up my talking about the paper for now, and yeah, open it up to yourselves. Any questions, any discussions, anything really? Yeah. Also, thank you for listening.
Thank you. No, it's fascinating, and it's so much food for thought. Because I'm moderating, I will go with the first question, if that's okay. I'm taking advantage of the privilege. Also giving time for people to think about other questions. Something that popped into as you were talking is that what you think was the easiest and the most challenging part of implementing reflexivity in your specific work, given it was very quantitative focus. But do you think it was the absolute, like the most straightforward and very easy and accessible, and possibly the most challenging part from your experience? Thank you.
Thank you, Vanya. I would say, I hesitate to call it easy, but I would say, just for the discussion's sake, the easiest part was actually doing it, like starting it and like actually writing about it. For me, I would physically write in diaries. I'd say that was the easiest. One, because of my background, and two, of course, I would write angsty poetry during my PhD. So writing about reflexivity personally kind of came from that practice. I'd say that was the easy part for me. For some colleagues, they find it really hard to physically start writing in that style, because we do sort of promote a less academic way of writing with the reflexivity, like promoting it being more personal. Some colleagues really struggled with that, even if it was just for themselves. I would say the hardest part about implementing it a little bit came from external factors. Like, as I said, I was doing a very traditional stats PhD. So one, I was a PhD student / researcher. Some people were like, why? Like, one, why are you doing this? Why are you thinking about this during a traditional stats PhD? And to some people in the quant space were a little bit offended. I only came across one or two people. It was more they took offence that they took offence that I thought they were bad researchers, not personally, but they somehow thought, oh, if I don't, how is my research bad if I don't examine my own biases? In which I would just be very open and accepting of their emotions around it. The psychologist never leaves you, and sort of just ask them, like, why, like, where is this coming from in yourself? And two, it can never hurt. I always say it never hurts to try. Yeah, just read the questions and see what comes up for you. So I would say the hardest bit was sort of spreading that idea, because there was quite a lot of pushback from certain areas. But yeah, I'm not always up for an argument. I'm always up for a discussion about why people have the thoughts they do around it. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Leon, please go ahead, and feel free, other people, to start raising hands and to go by order. Feel at home, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank
please do others raise questions, because I've got so many, and I don't want to hog this, but just to keep it going, because there's so much in your presentation, Michelle, and thanks for your work and for presenting it. And I think it's fascinating that you are, working in such a quantitative environment and yet addressing these issues very head on. I think that's tremendous. I really congratulate you on what you're doing. I do, as I say, have a lot of questions, but I'll try and restrict myself. So and perhaps one for now. You focus on reflexivity as a kind of central organizing notion, but you use a range of terms, and I'm just picking out some that you might do this differently. But the term bias comes up a lot, the term ethics, and also issues of representation. And I just wondered if you might say a little bit more about why you focus on reflexivity as the kind of primary notion, rather than, say, bias or ethics or representation, and how you see reflexivity as a concept, therefore.
Yeah, that is interesting. Thank you, Leon. I suppose we are certainly, when it came out of the PhD work, I settled on the reflexivity as the sort of overall framework for bias and ethics and everything else. One, I found it very helpful as a guide. Two, when it came out of the PhD work, I basically didn't have the time to go into examining, say, purely bias or purely ethics, or both at the same time, because I mean, people's whole careers are built on each of those things, and I was coming to the end of PhD funding. The reflexivity I also felt helped in examining those, say, the bias and ethics and other phrases I use within the paper, because I'd certainly had experience with reflection as a psychologist, and doing qualitative work, but reflexivity really stuck out for me, because reflection was after the fact. It was always after the fact. Reflexivity was something I could implement from the start and throughout and at the end, and circle back, whereas reflection to me always had an end point in my training, but the reflexivity, I could go back and back and back, and using that as the framework to then examine the biases and ethics, I found helped really guide me, because as you can probably tell from today, I can go off and off on a tangent forever and ever, and the supervisors needed work at the end of the day. But that was the whole reasoning behind it. I hope that answers your question a wee bit, Leon. There was nothing overly...
It was a typically reflective and reflexive response. Thank you. Makes sense. And I'm going to carry on asking questions until I see other hands. Please do, colleagues, jump in. And I would be interested to hear how people are experiencing this themselves. I mean, particularly in research, where sometimes we're driven by an agenda that is, a funder with a research question that sets the terms in terms of what the research questions are, to a degree, what the methodologies are, and how, thinking about, Georgia working on PP Plus and Alice on virtual school heads, how you deal with these issues where you're presented with something that's quite functional and pragmatic as a requirement, but then you're asking these similar questions, I imagine, to a degree, and how you sort of balance those issues. But so I would be interested in others' thoughts. But the other thing, I think one other thing I'd like to ask is when you talk about bias and the bias that results from personal positionality, and I wonder how you contrast or relate that to the notion of bias in statistical methodology, which that correlations and averages lead us into certain types of understanding, whether we have thought about our own positionality or not. I'm wondering whether you see bias in statistical methods, and maybe reflectivity is part of a solution to that, because you're taking out your personal biases when you look at that, but you're still left with, a kind of Galton set of statistical methodologies that maybe have biases baked into them regardless.
Yeah.
So I wonder how you see the tension between personal bias and kind of the bias of statistical methodologies, if I may.
Yeah. Yes, this was again something that came up a lot for me. One, because I was working with psychiatric data. I ended up writing a lot about how certain statistical methods came to be and how certain statisticians were and what they originally used their methods for. I'm sure yourselves know about the sort of racial and eugenics and the darker side of sort of stats and quantitative research. So that was always important for me to write about. And when I started examining my own personal biases, again, so it was really learning about the sort of eugenic side of some of the stat stuff, because I have family connections. My dad's side is Roma, so when I came across certain stats and eugenic stuff, that sort of triggered off the personal reflection and reflexivity for me. Growing out of that, while doing the PhD, I was using psychiatric data. I have personal experience of a severe mental health condition, and just taking the sample size, say the sample size in my data was under 100 people, usually people would be like, well, why encode them or why analyze it? But one, it was the whole reason for my PhD, and two, it became a really personal thing for me. At one point, I really did over-identify with people in my data, and it became such a personal thing. I was like, well, why should we just bin it because of this one method, because of the bias in this method, because of your bias, and that it might result in crap results? Like, why should they be ignored? And again, that was got me examining my own biases, whether positive or negative. Some people would argue my insistence on keeping them in was negative. Some people would argue it was positive, and that was the tension between my own biases and or what I see as the tension between my own biases and the biases and the methods. How this played out in reality was I really just got into heated debates with my supervisor when he had other meetings right after supervision, so it was always like a hand on the doorknob revelation. But yeah, without going off on a massive tangent, I hope that answers your question, Leon, because I realise I just went off on a...
No, it really does. Thank you. I appreciate that answer. We all struggle with that question of I mean, I do, of Galton, who, as you say, developed early correlational studies out of a clear drive to be proving his own bias, that social class represented kind of almost like species level, genetic differentiation. And does that mean that our statistical methods are fundamentally flawed and have prejudice baked in, or did he accidentally invent something that has more objectivity? I think that's I don't think statisticians are engaging enough with those questions. It's interesting that you have had that same reflection as well. So thank you. That's great.
Yeah. Thank you. I would say answering these questions and being vocal about it, to some traditional statisticians, they just think I'm like the strange person at the lunch group or something because I'm talking about this. They want to talk about something very theoretical, and I was gabbing on about bias. But yeah, thank you, Leon. Ian, yourself, you've got a question.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to ask you a very practical question. I think you touched on it in your answer you were just giving there, really. I like the idea. I can understand the idea of the purpose of this. But my question is about how you're using. So you've written down your questions, you've done your toolkit, you've thought about it. Is the intention that you should then change the way you're doing the work? and actually try and take account of the things you identified, or is it to provide documentation of kind of the context and the assumptions to somebody who gets the work at the end?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ian. And I think it's, I hope this isn't a cop-out answer. I think it's different for every person. Like, it might say, it might come down to your funder, your time limits. Say you do identify biases when you're doing your analysis. Can you then go back and change them? Really, you shouldn't. Or that opens up whole other questions with your team. What you should do, what should you do? So what you want to do with it, I think, is really personal to yourself, your team, your project. If you want to put it online, if you want to keep it just for yourself, I would argue, say you go through this process and during it you realise there is some biases or something could have been done, I put in quotation marks, better in some way, but you can't implement it at the time. I would say then your next project, that's in itself, doing the process has been a learning experience, so you can carry that forward into the next project practically, I would hope. Yeah, does that illustrate a wee bit?
That's good. Thank you very
Hopefully
much.
it wasn't a cop-out, Ian, sorry. Alice, yourself.
Yeah, it's more of a building on that conversation just there. I wonder if other terms from sort of traditional qualitative quality criteria, such as like transparency, might be helpful here. So when you're taking a reflexive approach, is it about, you mentioned if you notice that there are biases, should you change them? Or maybe not, but you should be transparent about what they are in the write-up and that sort of thing. So I just wondered if there's some terms from the qualitative space as well as reflexivity that you've drawn on that might be helpful to bring into the quantitative space as well.
Yeah. There definitely is, and a lot of the terms in the qualitative space have come through in the paper, or even just when I'm talking, and that has really helped, especially guide the toolkit. I also think it's a nice introduction for people who haven't been qualitatively trained. Like, hopefully it sparks something curious off in themselves and they can go and experience it from that. But yeah, you're right. If, say, something does come up and it can't be changed, just in the act of being reflexive, you've recorded it, and hopefully it is transparent. It'd certainly be transparent to you. And what I mean by that is, say I go through the process, but the reflexive diaries I've kept I feel are too personal to put up on the team's OSF page. It's still transparent to me, and I might take that to like team meetings and talk about it, but I might not want it up on OSF. Or for example, I included personal diary entries in my PhD that was presented at the Viva because it was part of the reflexive process and made clear like the transparency was throughout. But when my PhD got put up on the site, I asked for certain parts to be redacted, like street names and things like that. So I think how transparent it is, again, I'm sorry, it comes down to you personally and what you're comfortable with, because I say it in the paper and I'll say it now, like, never in doing this process, you don't have to reveal anything that you're not comfortable with. And that's a personal, comes down to personal decisions at the end of the day. Does that, or hopefully that goes some way to answer your question, Alice.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much. Joanna, yourself.
Thanks very much, Michelle. I think this is so very, very interesting, because one thing that struck me as when you're talking about excluding parts of a sample and collapsing categories, was I was thinking that in some ways the bigger a sample gets and the more we have this sort of protective idea that it's sort of representative and objective and it's got more power, almost the more likely we are to make these quite casual exclusions. And I was working once on a sample that was 150,000 people, and 3,000 people on a particular variable. There were sort of anomalies about this, and I was told I would just exclude those people. And it's only 3,000 out of 150,000. And I thought, this is so really important to have people thinking about this. It means relinquishing a bit of control. I saw parallels to sort of participatory work and having sort of experts by lived experience involved in your analysis, which is very difficult to do, or there's a lot of resistance to it in quantitative work anyway. I think that to change the way people look at this and to sort of normalize it, one of the routes would be into obviously getting it to be a requirement for journal articles. And we're sort of seeing this a little bit in health, in systematic reviews, you know, more and more sort of putting in section about your reflexivity in terms of how you're selecting. I wondered whether you were sort of planning to, or had kind of had any contact with any journals to be sort of getting a sense of whether it's something that they might want to be adopting in some of their quantity, or in fact, if they do, I don't know, perhaps there are journals that already are doing this.
Yeah. No, that was great insight, Joanna. Yes, I think I'm sure there will be journals that do it, especially qualitative, but in terms of quantitative, funnily enough, when we submitted this article to the journal of, I think we ended up in a social psychology journal, they came back and asked us where our reflexivity statements were. So we'd submitted the article and they were like, well, where is it? We did submit it, and then the journal in question also has the conflict of interest statements, the COI statements that you'll sometimes see a lot in quantitative. So within that, so we submitted longer reflexivity stuff, and they were like, oh, we don't actually have a place for that, but you can submit a COI. And I was like, okay, do you see do you see why we've done this, and things like that. So at the end of the article, you'll see the COI. I think maybe in the appendix we did manage to submit the longer reflexivity statements, but we certainly said to them, and they were interested, because it's the first time it kind of came up for them, like, oh, maybe we should have an option for longer reflexivity statements, because there's a little paragraph in the paper where we talk about how COIs are a good way forward, but they can be used, say, performatively, or some people, like, they're just an add-on at the end, and things like that. So yeah, having the option to have that bigger piece would be a good way to go, and certainly the journal were keen. But yeah, it'd be fantastic if it was just an option across all journals. I can dream. But yeah, thank you, Joanna. Hopefully that goes some way in answering. Ellen, yourself. Oh, you're muted, Ellen.
You are muted.
Thank you. I think it's an amazing way. We, I guess, typically don't think of reflexivity so much on the quant side, and how valuable it is for us to think about who we're researching, what all research is about. Because not all researchers have good experience of, these people and the social aspects that they're researching. So my question to you was, have you experienced a change in the way that you work? Perhaps you were a researcher that did quantitative not qualitative, quantitative research. So I could see how that might be different in the way that the person works or approaches their methodology and the choices they make. So did you experience any difference in the way that you work, qualitatively versus quantitatively, in maybe targets that you've had in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ellen. So because I'd sort of done my psychology training before, and I had done dissertations that were wholly qualitative based, going into the sort of pure quants sphere, one, doing that training, and two, then get on to do my PhD and try to integrate the reflexivity and everything else. I would say now, and considering I'm in a sort of research fellowship that's data science quants based, I would say now I'm actually more open and more reflexive as a researcher than I was when I was a pure qualitative researcher. Now, when I was a pure qualitative researcher, I was always an undergrad through to masters, and then psychology training. It's a little bit different. I would say now, in the space that I'm just now, yeah, much more reflexive. Like I did, I'm not doing myself a disservice, but at the end of the day, I was a student when I was engaging with the qualitative methods. I was engaging with them probably on quite a surface level, and obviously being guided by supervisors and things like that. So I'd say my experience definitely was different. And now in my role today and coming through that, I would say, yeah, I'm a lot more engaged with the reflexive sides of things, for the better. Hopefully we can always all, I don't think we're ever done growing as researchers, and that's a good thing. But yeah, I would say, yeah, to me the differences are night and day, and only for the better. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Georgia, yourself?
I've really enjoyed the talk and the paper as well. But I just wondered, obviously your toolkit really usefully goes through the different stages of research and kind of ideas where people can be reflexive. I wondered, and I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm kind of interested in the quantitative side of it. I wondered if there were particular points within, kind of through the stages, where it was more of a challenge to get quantitative researchers to be reflexive or to think about bias, etc. Just are some areas kind of more easily adapted to this approach than others?
Yeah. I would say the most difficult point for quantitative researchers to engage with, and one, I think it comes from loads of different things in that person, whether it's their training, their personal beliefs, their backgrounds. So the question around why are you the one to do this work has proved quite difficult, and I understand why. One, it's quite a heavy question and very open, and if you're coming at it like, I am a data scientist, I've been given this data, I've been given this funding to look at this data, like for example myself on the project I'm on just now, so why wouldn't it be me looking at this data? Like, I've been hired to look at this data, why wouldn't it be me? So when they're engaging with this question, it can bring up loads of different things for different people. No one's ever gotten like out and out angry about it. Frustration. Frustration, I think, has come up for some people, because for some people, yeah, they have been hired to look at this one data set, and they are the only researcher on this project at that uni looking at it, so why isn't it them? So then when I'm trying to say, like, do you want to try and engage more with why you, like, what led you here, even just starting from a further back point, what led you to applying to this fellowship to look at this data, like what excites you about this data, so for some people the question can be quite negative, so it's trying to reframe it for a lot of people, and that tends to yield better results. I'm fully aware of my examples I've gave today makes it sound like I've delivered this, because I have delivered this as training and it's been like a massive fight or something in the room. It's not. It's just been interesting how people come to the questions depending on their background. So yeah, I'd say that's always the one sticking point. They find it relatively easy to engage with other things, especially around why they've dropped variables and things like that. But the why you, I suppose it is a really big and heavy question. Yeah.
I think there's something as well about, so people not becoming defensive, but also about appreciating, even just understanding the potential value that somebody else doing the research, that I don't know, for instance, someone with lived experience of something could bring, and it's maybe so it's not set up to be antagonistic or to start a fight, but it's just to grow our kind of understanding of and the implications of what we're doing, isn't it?
Yeah. And I always come at it from that sort of perspective, and especially working with administrative health data. If they are struggling with that question, I will usually say something or ask them to think about, like, what makes you different from the person in the data. Like, a lot of the times there's not that much separating us from the people in the data, or a lot of the time there's massive chasms between us, other times there's not. So even just framing it in that way, I've always found really helpful, and it just leads to such amazing conversations. Yeah, I love it. Thank you, Georgia. Joanna, yourself?
Just wanted to add to that, is that question that in research centre I was in, we found useful was to, at the start of, before we even start the analysis, just to ask everybody, what are you expecting to find?
Yeah.
and that was very, very revealing of our kind of biases when we approach it.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a great way to start that. Yeah.
We are approaching the end. I don't know if there is any very burning question. Otherwise, I'm sure that Michelle will be very happy to hear from us.
Oh yeah.
By email and all the rest. First, I would like to thank everyone who joined for contributing to such a fruitful and engaging discussion, but not least, on the contrary, a big thank you to you, Michelle. No, it has been such an interesting and engaging and important discussion. It kept us all on our toes to think about this question. So we're just so very grateful that you could join us today. And wishing you all a lovely day. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you.
Thank you everyone. I'll ask
Thanks so much.
yourself, Vanya, to pass around my email if anyone has any questions. I would love to hear from you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Michelle. It's tremendous, and thanks, Vanya, for organising. Great to see everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.